Good afternoon and welcome everyone. I am Rosa Cabrera, Director of the Rafael Cintron Ortiz Latino Cultural Center at UIC, or the LCC as most people call it. Thank you for joining us in our Climates of Inequality online series. This is the second run of Climates of Inequality. Last fall, 2020, we presented local leaders working on environmental and climate justice in the Chicago area. And this fall, we are extending the conversation to ECJ champions from across the country and abroad. Our guest speakers are sharing frameworks and solutions that utilize a justice and equity lens to address the negative effects of climate change and exposure to toxic pollution that has disproportionately burdened communities where Blacks, Indigenous, and people of colors live. You can find the presentation videos for both seasons in the LCC website. I believe that they will be putting their link in the chat at some point. And so I just want to provide a little bit of context here to get the presentation going. Hurricane Maria made landfall in Puerto Rico 4 years ago, while people in the island were still coping with the aftermath of Hurricane Irma. And all of us from afar watched the destruction of homes, roads, and bridges, the failure of their electrical power, the shortage of food and clean water, and the lack of access to hospitals and many other necessities that are essential to human survival and certainly crucial in coping with the aftermath of climate disaster. We also watched the failures of governmental response that left people on the island to subsist on their own. 4 years later, Puerto Rico is still recovering from a collective trauma that has been intensified by the coronavirus. So today's program will underscore the strength of community response and the significance of mutual aid as a form of resistance and solidarity in the aftermath of Hurricane Maria and during COVID-19. The presenters draw on their own experiences living in Puerto Rico and voices from local residents who are part of an oral history project called Mi Maria, Surviving the Storm, Voices from Puerto Rico. And this is the book that will be raffled at the end of the presentation. So you want to stay around to be able to participate in the raffle. Before we start the presentation, a few shout-outs are in order to our Climate of Inequality partners, the Humanities Action Lab, where the Climates of Inequality project resides, and organizations Alianza Americas and Little Village Environmental Justice Organization known as El Vejo. To our co-sponsors, the UIC Sustainability Fee, Global Migration Working Group, Latin American and Latino Studies Social Justice Initiative, the Department of Anthropology, CIMAS Project, Freshwater Lab, Great Cities Institute, Honors College, Las Ganas Project, and Museums and Exhibition Studies. And to the students panelists in my Environmental and Climate Justice class, Emma Acosta, Carla Luna, Alejandro Morales, and Leslie Bisuet. The presentation will be for about 30 minutes long, followed by a short conversation between these students and our guest speakers. And people who are participating can put questions on the chat and comments, and we might have time to at least go through some of those. Now I'm happy and honored to introduce our guest speaker who are joining us from Puerto Rico. I'll start with Ricia and Chansky, who is professor of English at the University of Puerto Rico in Mayagüez. She's the director of the award-winning mass listening project, Mi Maria, Puerto Rico After the Hurricane, and currently serves as a research fellow on 2 Mellon Foundation-funded projects, Climates of Inequality at the Humanities Action Lab, where I have had the pleasure to work with Ricia in the past 3 years. and the Archivo de Respuestas Emergencias de Puerto Rico. She has a new book, Mi María, Surviving the Storm, Voices from Puerto Rico, which is the book that I mentioned before. And two forthcoming books, that Anti-States, Untangling National Identity in the 21st Century, and Matzi Survives the Hurricane. In Spanish, Matzi Sobrevive el Huracán. Professor Chansky has recently won awards from the Modern Language Association, the National Endowment for the Arts, and the Oral History Association, and was recognized by the Simon Wiesenthal Center and Museum of Tolerance as a global human rights leader for her work in environmental justice. We are also very excited to have two graduate students from the University of Puerto Rico in Mayagüez, Natalia Betancourt Malave, who is currently a master's in arts student in the English education program. Her academic interests center on minority representation in the media, particularly television, and how the intersectionality of race and gender is presented and performed. The second student is Aleixka Esteves Quintana, who has a BA in English with a minor in writing and communication, and is currently working towards a master's in English education. Welcome to the program, Ricia, Natalia, and Aleixka. We are so looking forward to your presentation and conversation with the ECJ students and all of us. It is all yours.
Thank you so much, Rosa. I appreciate very much your friendship and collaboration over the years, and it is my great pleasure to be here with you tonight. I'd like to thank the Latino Cultural Center for hosting us, and I'd like to specifically say thank you to Jocelyn for all of her work to set up this project. And I'd like to say thank you to the folks over at the Humanities Action Lab who have put together a really unique project that support all of us being able to work together as we all fight for climate justice. I want to mention two things before we start. The first is that we're in the middle of a disaster capitalism episode in which our electric utility has been leased by a private corporation, and that has triggered massive rolling blackouts. So we hope that our electricity and internet holds tonight. If it doesn't, we'll hop back on, and please excuse us. The second thing that I want to say is that we will be referencing some stories of trauma, and we want to say that up front so that if this is not quite the right time for you to listen to stories of trauma, you should feel free to duck out at any moment. We certainly understand, after having lived this and shared this for many years, that sometimes it's a little much to hold. I'm going to share my screen now, I hope, for a PowerPoint, and I'm hopeful that this is something that I can do with ease, and it looks like we're good to go. I'm going to start by giving an overview of our project, the first stage of our project, which is called Mi Maria, and the second stage of our project, which is called Sheltered in Place. And then Natalia and Aleixka are going to talk a little bit about some of the cool and exciting things that they're doing in the program. And then we're going to circle back to me for a second so that I can introduce a secondary part of the project. And then again, Aleixka and Natalia will walk you through the cool things that they're doing. And then I'll make a small finishing up comment, hopefully staying within the half hour that we have here. We will try our best. So tonight's presentation is called Everybody Eats, Stratified Disasters and Food Insecurity in Puerto Rico. Rosa, I'm very grateful for you for setting this up so nicely, because I can cut just a little bit that I was going to say here. Hurricane Maria made landfall in the Puerto Rican archipelago on September 20th, 2017. And it's important to understand that this hurricane decimated the entire archipelago, destroying tens of thousands of homes, destroying farms, destroying businesses, cutting off supply lines so that we didn't have food or clean drinking water, cutting off access to healthcare, and that's both physical health and mental well-being, and preventing the repair of the electric grid, the repair of water pipes, and also preventing internet services from being offered, telecommunication services in general. So when we began at our campus, and this is the campus that the three of us are at now and that we were at after the hurricane, that meant that when courses resumed just over a month after the hurricane, they resumed in part to continue our studies, but also in part to provide services and safety for people. And I think that that's very important to what we're talking about this evening, because our campus surpassed the physical boundaries of a campus to open to the community and to provide for our students, for our faculty, for the members of our campus community, but also for the members of the community in Mayaguez, certain resources that were otherwise unavailable. So we were one of the only places on the west coast of the main island of Puerto Rico that had somewhat stable electricity, that occasionally had internet, that often had running water. But we were also a place in which people could acquire clean drinking water, could acquire food, and could acquire basic medical care. And so I think that that's important for us to recognize that the university became a hub in that disaster. One of the things that the university asked faculty to do after we returned to campus was to have students fill out a material needs form. What is your status? Do you have food? Do you have clean drinking water? Do you have a place to sleep? Are you injured? And because my area of study is autobiography studies, and what I have done in my career is consider the ways in which people tell the stories of their life, I invited students to add to this questionnaire about material conditions some part of their personal story of Hurricane Maria, and I called it Hurricane Memoirs. This was ungraded, it was voluntary, it was in no way mandatory, it had nothing to do with a grade. I was simply saying, because of what the urgency of what we have had to do after the hurricane, perhaps you haven't had a chance to lighten your load and share part of your story. So I opened the door for that. I was shocked to receive over 100 hurricane memoirs. The majority of them were written on paper with pencil, and I read them by candlelight because it would still be long months before we had electricity. I warned you that you might feel emotional about some of the things we say tonight, but now I warn you that I might feel emotional about some of the things I say tonight. I read stories of students who were in homes in which the roof peeled off in the hurricane and flew away, and people's possessions flew after them. I read stories about people holding on to their grandmothers and crying for hours as the hurricane raged outside. The words screaming and crying were repeated again and again. One student described the experience as living in a post-apocalyptic movie after the bomb has gone off. I finally came to the narrative of a student named Alejandra, and Alejandra told me that the saddest part of her life was watching her neighbors dig 2 graves in their backyard because family members had passed away after the hurricane because the electricity remained off and the hospital remained closed. So these family members had medical conditions that were fully treatable under typical circumstances, and they had passed away because in the aftermath, aid was not forthcoming, support was not forthcoming. And this is when I decided to begin my first project, Mi Maria, Puerto Rico, after the hurricane, because I felt as though students were carrying too much with them. I was concerned that they felt disempowered, that they had no means of creating change. They had no means of helping themselves, their families, and their communities. In the Mi Maria project, myself and my colleague, Jocelyn Haliga Vargas, taught 4 oral history courses on campus. We trained approximately 150 undergraduate students in the ethical collection, transcription, translation, editing, and dissemination of oral histories of disaster. We were lucky enough to partner with 2 organizations in that project. The first organization is Voice of Witness, which is a nonprofit organization that believes that by amplifying individual people's stories, we create change. And that's the book that Rosa mentioned to you that will be raffled off this evening. 17 narratives are in that book, 8 of which began as student projects in those classes. And I'm ridiculously proud of the fact that what we did in our classrooms and students committed to an intensive editing and follow-up program after those courses ended. But I'm incredibly proud that 8 students have their work shared in that book. The Humanities Action Lab, where Rosa and I met and where we work together, is a translocal community group, community action group. And what that means is that each of the 27 partners in the group have their own individual issues that they are addressing through climate justice, but we understand that our work is all interlinked. You are now experiencing the Climates of Inequality exhibition that Rosa contributed to and that myself and my students in the Memoria project contributed to as well. As we were, and I don't want to say winding down, because I think in a project like this, you never quite wind down your work because you make such personal attachments. And but as we were sort of thinking through how we were finishing up the book and how we were finishing up our contribution to Climates of Inequality at the Humanities Action Lab, we all began to face the global pandemic of COVID-19. And so the project that Aleshka and Natalia and I want to tell you a little bit more about tonight is the project called Sheltered in Place. We developed this project because on December 28, 2019, the first of a series of over 5,000 earthquakes hit Puerto Rico. And the scientific name is actually a swarm. So the swarm of earthquakes is still ongoing, and we are still having earthquakes since that time. As you all know, March 2019 was really, March 2020 was the time that we all started to shelter in place because of the coronavirus. And I started asking myself, what happens when you need to stay at home, but your home is damaged? Whether the home is now unstable because of a series of earthquakes, or your home still does not have a roof years after Hurricane Maria has made landfall. What happens when you're told to wash your hands at every moment when you do not have running water, or your water is not safe to use, or you are relocated into a tent city because of the earthquakes and there's no running water there? And so I started thinking a lot about how do we shelter in place? How do we take care of ourselves when there are other lingering or ongoing issues of disaster? And so I started to ask the question, what is a stratified disaster? What does it mean to experience one disaster when you're still experiencing another disaster and then a third disaster comes? But in our case in Puerto Rico, and I would venture to say that this is the case for lots of folks, there are other stressors on the system. One of the stressors for us is that we have a colonial relationship with the United States. The United States decides what relief goods pass to us, what means of mitigating disaster are enacted in the archipelago. And that's tied very closely to systemic racism that decides whose stories and whose lives matter and how that relationship to community is built. One of the things that is very important to understand in our situation is that because of the colonial relationship with the United States, an act was passed in the US Congress that's called the PROMESA Act. And the PROMESA Act instilled an external fiscal oversight and management board in Puerto Rico. And how that board has decided to oversee economic well-being in Puerto Rico is by enacting austerity measures that have triggered a humanitarian crisis. Cut down on medical services, cut down on social services, cut down on educational services, cut down on anything that is for the well-being of the people. And so it's important to think that as much as we have the natural disaster of the hurricane, we have the disaster of the earthquakes, we have the global pandemic of COVID. All of this is happening within an economic depression that is triggering a humanitarian crisis because of these austerity measures. So when I'm talking about stratified disasters, I'm talking about one on top of the other, on top of the other, and how do we think about that? And obviously these issues intersect as well, and there's important intersection to think about. But I like the term stratification because we're talking about human beings and the weight of what is placed upon human beings. How we've decided to move forward in this project is trying to understand how people eat. When we look at the oral histories that we gathered in the Memoria project, we saw 4 main threads. Our 4 main threads were potable water, that people could not get clean drinking water, did not have access to clean drinking water. In addition to that, food insecurity became a very important issue because our supply lines were broken. Hurricane Irma, that was 2 weeks before Hurricane Maria, did make landfall in Florida. 87% of the food in Puerto Rico is imported, and the majority of that comes through a single port in Florida. In addition to that, the majority of our farmland was destroyed in Puerto Rico during the hurricane. The majority of our livestock was either destroyed in the hurricane, or a very strange phenomenon happened in which livestock could not give a live birth for months, and in some cases up to a year after the hurricane. In addition to that, grocery stores were destroyed, or grocery stores could not receive goods. We had instances in which FAMO did not coordinate with communities on the ground. And so the distribution of goods was based upon an external map of where people assumed food was needed, rather than in collaboration with folks on the ground who could see where food was needed. So this is something that became very interesting to us on the project, because there are different needs, right? So the needs that we have in the aftermath of a hurricane is to get healthy food to people, sometimes in remote areas, sometimes in places that other folks couldn't reach. But under the COVID pandemic, we had a need to be physically distanced from the people we love, the people we care about, the people that we saw in need, especially our elders. And so we started to think about this need for food, and we started to think about how do we adapt. And we are in the process of looking at some pretty amazing mutual aid organizations, some of which were in existence prior to the hurricane, most of which came up during the urgency after the hurricane. And then instead of saying, okay, we're done, let's finish, said, wait a minute, we have new needs. How do we adapt for the earthquakes? How do we adapt for COVID? We have what I'm going to call a main partner and then micro partners. And I just want to be clear that we're not using the term micro to indicate lesser than or worth less than. Micro partners in the sense that we're meeting with them for a certain amount of time, where we do have one major partner that we're spending the majority of our time with. Our major partner is Come Colegial, and Come Colegial is led by a woman named Lucy Serrano Gaston. And Aleshka and Natalia are going to tell you a lot more about Lucy in just a second. But Lucy is a person who saw that at the beginning of the economic crisis, students were having to choose between rent and tuition, and between food and tuition. And we had a really terrible moment on our campus when we came across a group of students sleeping inside one of the buildings because they couldn't afford to both go to school and pay for shelter or food. Lucy stood up at that time and Lucy said, this is unacceptable, and I'm going to start an organization to feed students. Before the hurricane, and I'm going to get emotional over this again, before the hurricane, Lucy and those of us who were working with her were feeding approximately 101 students. After the hurricane, there was open enrollment and they had to end at 1,104 because they simply ran out of food. And so this is an organization that was in existence before the hurricane. It was created to address the economic need. It adapted to feed folks after the hurricane. And then it shifted again to create boxed meals to distribute. So what we're thinking about here is how did Comeclihiel respond to Hurricane Maria? How did it respond to COVID? And how did it evolve? Because it is now a model that's being incorporated at all 11 campuses of UPR and beyond the campus. Before I turn it over to my wonderful partners, I just want to say that we're thinking through, and we certainly haven't come to any final decisions here about what is best or perfect in any sense of the imagination, but we're trying to think through what is a trauma-informed methodology. And this is something that we've talked to the Voice of Witness folks a lot about. And so what we try to do in our work is not reduce people or people's stories to the event of trauma or the event of disaster. We try to get a whole life story. And I know that that would be exhausting and impossible if we said, tell me every single thing in your life up until this moment. But what we try to understand is the trajectory that led a person to the place that we're studying. And in this project, it's very important for us to understand comida criolla, the Puerto Rican typical food that has influences from Afro-diasporic communities, from indigenous communities, and from European communities. And we're trying to understand what is the relationship, the existing relationship that folks have with food. How is that a resource that might be an understood or unnamed resource when we're thinking about disaster response and disaster relief? And how are people using that resource of cultural tradition in food in mutual aid after disaster and in times of crisis? So I'm sorry that I talked that long, and I will now turn it over to my wonderful partners who will tell you a little bit about what they have learned so far from Lucy Serrano Gaston's whole life story before she founded Comeclihiel and how that leads into her mutual aid organization.
Thank you so much, Dr. Chansky. So, oh, can you go back? Thank you.
There you go, sorry.
It's okay. So on our first interview with Lucy, we discussed with her background with food, and particularly how her relationship with food began. What were her first memories of her favorite food, or her first memories actually making a recipe with her family. And she described how basically every meal in her home was prepared with a family effort, meaning that everyone had to participate in one way or another. However, for this, I want to discuss her experience making the traditional Puerto Rican Christmas dinner, because it is a tradition that is shared by many families throughout the archipelago. And by talking about this tradition, I mean making the food from scratch. And as Lucy says, every Christmas, her family would kill a pig and then use every single part of it to prepare the Christmas meal. That pig is used to make pasteles, morcilla, and even as a child, Lucy knew the progress of how to make all of these processes. She found the entire ordeal of making morcilla particularly very grotesque and explained how traumatizing it was for her to first listen to the pig being killed and then having to clean everything up and the entrails, including the feces and the blood that came out of the intestines. And she later explains that she couldn't even eat the morcilla afterwards because she could remember the process and be disgusted by it. She would later, as she grew up, make up excuses to be out of the house when this was happening so that she wouldn't have to deal with those parts of the tradition. Thankfully, however, her niece loves this tradition and continues it with her grandparents, Lucy's parents. And now that Lucy's parents are elderly people, they cannot raise the pig themselves or kill it themselves. So they actually pay someone else to do this part of the process for them. And so that process takes about a year to happen. And so that's why it's a Christmas tradition. And so pasteles, morcilla, and even lechon asado are some of the dishes that can be made from a pig, just for different multiple meals. And so this is a good example of how a tradition itself began as a measure to ensure food security for everyone in a community. Second, on the topic of tradition, Lucy mentioned el aguinaldo, which is a big tradition for her and her mother does it every year around the same time, Christmas time. And so it's almojábanas, dulce de coco, arroz con gandules, arroz con dulce, placed in a plate and covered in foil. And so that was Lucy's mother's favorite aguinaldo to her and her neighbors. Lucy, however, is a lot less traditional with all of this, and she does it whenever she feels up for it or when she has some antojo or a special desire for any of these sweets. And so I love the idea of el aguinaldo because it details how we can use food to care for and support one's community simply by sharing what we have. Next slide. The next slide, thank you. And so here I posted some pictures, the first. Thank you, sorry. So I posted some pictures of what Lucy's mother prepared in her aguinaldos. So we have el arroz con dulce, which is basically rice, sweetened rice with raisins and cinnamon. Almojábanas are basically made out of rice flour and cheese and milk, and they're fried and they are delicious. And dulce de coco, which is basically made with coconut, and morcilla, which, as I explained, it's made with the entrails of the pig. Thank you so much.
Okay, so thank you. Can you hear me? Yeah, thank you. One of the aspects that we want to follow with Lucy's narrative is the struggle and having to provide for a family. So these difficult moments in which people are forced to have to support their family by any means necessary. And this becomes a conversation of what is especially difficult for women in our society. And in the case of Lucy's narrative, that women are most expected to contribute in household chores. And then also, what type of labor can a mother do to provide for her family? So domestic labor then becomes something that is really important and something that we can observe in this narrative. And kind of from talking to Lucy, she has been cooking since she was like in 5th grade, so like 10 years old. And that this involves like a process of having to set up the cooking process for her mother to come home at 5 p.m. after she works in the factory. Lucy's mother worked at a sewing factory in Puerto Rico, the Brob factory called Maiden Form, right? So this is also an aspect of kind of colonial relationships with the United States. So the sewing industry was a very important factor in Puerto Rico, one that kind of contributed to the migration of individuals in our island. But then also it provided a job for Lucy's mother to be able to support her family, right? So what aspects she could provide financially for her family. And Lucy, in her narrative, is also very thankful for her family for being able to provide support for her to go to university, to get an education, because they both had jobs, because they both were able to financially support her. And there's also this aspect of the informal economy in which Lucy's mother participated. So not only did she provide labor at a factory, but then there's also this aspect of selling her work, her food. She did this through pasteles, which are the image that you see here, pasteles, traditionally a food that's like in the holidays. It's eaten now. It's kind of rare because not a lot of people take the time to make it. It's a very elaborate recipe, kind of like the morcilla. So not a lot of people take the time to make it. And so this aspect of selling pasteles and having that economic means through it is not taught, is not taxed, it's not monitored by the government. And so this is a way of gaining money for people in their homes. So they do this in their own kitchens, and they are able to provide economic funds for their families. And this is something that's still, most of the people who do this are older. So Lucy's mother still does this, selling the pasteles, but then of course she's also a little bit older, so she doesn't do it as much. I have a couple quotes right here, right? So Lucy says, my mom was a great cook. In fact, she was well known in Mayagüez because she made the pasteles. So this was something that was a business for her, and it was also very in demand. And it's important to note the traditional cuisine here, and also the expertise involved in producing these recipes, and also memorializing the recipes is an important aspect of it. And Lucy talks about her mom's cooking like it's delicious, it's the best thing that ever happened. And there's also this aspect of having to sell the pasteles, right? So not only sharing the food to the community, but then also having to sell this in order to support a family. And there's these when we're talking about labor, domestic labor, and what is expected, gender labor. So in her narrative, Lucy also mentions economía doméstica. I'm not sure how to say that in English, but the class that Lucy participated in school, which is part of the school curriculum, which is a very gendered class in which girls learn to cook and sew. And so this becomes something that is both very traditional, right? These traditional gendered experiences, but then also become a means of learning how to provide for yourself in a certain way. And then this conversation of education comes into play, and how important it is to provide a necessary public education, access to education, and how students need to be able to be fed. Students need to be fed in order to properly and adequately pay attention to their education. So we can see how these experiences that Lucy has translate into her passion in Come Colegial, right? They have a motto that a brain cannot be fed on an empty stomach. And so we see those parallels there, where we have to be able to feed our students in order for them to do their best.
Thank you, Aleshka and Natalia. And so Natalia and Aleshka have presented some really strong examples here of what is a food culture in Puerto Rico. What does a traditional food culture look like? What does a traditional, or what can traditional food culture provide for individuals and families and communities in terms of economic liberation and sustenance, caregiving for the entire community? And so this is the foundation we're laying for our study of Come Colegial, and how are we looking at tradition manifesting as more formalized mutual aid. This is a pedagogical project, and the work that we're doing with the Humanities Action Lab is developing a new generation of leadership. And so what we've done in our project is I've designed this larger project about food insecurity and about how we can look at cultural history leading to mutual aid and informing mutual aid. And each of the graduate students on the project, Aleshka, Natalia, and their collaborators, has developed a smaller version of the project. Each one of them has identified a mutual aid organization in their home area that they are particularly interested in, one that also uses food as the basis of the work that they do, one that spans Hurricane Maria and COVID-19, and the hurricanes, and the economic system, or picks out elements of those. So Aleshka and Natalia have each designed their own project at the microsite, and I'm supporting the work that they're doing, but they've really developed their projects themselves. So just as a conclusion, they're each going to speak about their own microsite. If I can make the slides work, they're going to do that. There we go.
Okay, so I focused on community access to local produce. And so when choosing the microsites, we were looking into local organizations that were helping secure or were helping provide food security during the pandemic. And so around the same time, my mom began volunteering at her church, Espiritu Santo in Toa Baja, and she was helping them distribute boxes of food to the community. And so this food was provided by the local government. Some mayors used some of the federal funds to buy off the produce from local farmers in the island and then distribute it through their municipalities. So the boxes had fresh produce as well as frozen meats, cheeses, milk, among other food. And so in Toa Baja, these were given to the local churches and organizations who distributed the food through different methods. So in the church that my mom goes to, they did a drive-through pickup system. So they would just have everything in tables and you would drive by and they would put everything in your trunk. So the local government and the churches themselves would share when and where the food would be distributed, and so through their social media, and so people would just drop by whenever they were available during that period. In my town, where I live in Bayamón, the volunteers drove through the neighborhoods, delivering the food to the houses themselves. And so in my municipality, once the people received the boxes, you would fill out a sort of survey, a voluntary survey, so that the municipality could keep records of where the food was going. It is important to note here that this initiative was not successful in all the municipalities. There have been reports that some of the funds were stolen or mismanaged. So I'm discussing this particular instance in these two neighboring municipalities, in which this model was actually productive and helped a lot of people for several months. So the organization within the church that my mom belongs to and that I chose as my microsite, it's named Caritas. And I chose it because it was an organization that I saw stepped up within my community when people were in need. And so after Hurricane Maria, many people struggled to gain access to food, water, and electricity. At the time, most of us believed that the resources were simply not there. However, in the time past, multiple warehouses filled with spoiled food, water, and supplies have been found. Food, water, and supplies that could have saved hundreds, if not thousands of lives. So while some resources were kept from the people by politicians trying to portray themselves as savers and then eventually never actually gave out the food, which led to the summer of 2019 here in Puerto Rico, where Ricky Rosselló was removed from his seat in government. He was the governor. We now know that some of these supplies were not distributed because the government also did not have access to the communities. And essentially did not know how to distribute the food to the communities. So the fact of the matter is that Puerto Rico churches are at the center of most communities. So the best way to access that community is through the church, whether or not you belong to that religion or whether or not you belong to that religion. Which is why in moments like this, collaboration between the church and the government is not only important, but necessary for our survival.
Okay, the organization that I identified in my town of Mayagüez, right, is called A la Cena Feminista, which translates to the Feminist Cup Board. And they call themselves a space that seeks to eradicate and combat low accessibility to food and items which are basic necessities in Mayagüez and the surrounding areas. And so this group was built on the values of solidarity, mutual aid, and food distribution during crisis. So kind of like what Natalia is talking about, they saw the need to distribute properly materials, right? So some people in our community weren't receiving materials because of X, Y reason, right? Either the government couldn't access them, or there were some places that they had to go. You know, not everyone is comfortable going to a specific place to access that help, that aid. And so the Feminist Cup Board, right, La Cena Feminista, they kind of built this space in the urban area, right? So they took an abandoned municipal area. This is, if you've ever been to Mayagüez or if you've ever been to an urban area in Puerto Rico, you know that there are a lot of abandoned stores, a lot of abandoned structures. And so they kind of took over one of these structures, right? And built shelves, built makeshift boxes where they could place food that is easily accessible to everyone. So it's not hidden behind a lock, it's not hidden behind a door, anyone can just walk in. It's in the street, right? So it's in the lacera, so you can just walk in, take what you need, and you can also walk in and leave what you can. And so that's their motto: take what you need, leave what you can. And it's the expectation is that this is a self-sufficient space that needs no monitoring, it needs no gatekeeping, and so people can just access it as they need, and they can feel free and unjudged to take the items that are necessary. So when we're talking about some of these items that are not typically shared, so feminine hygiene products, they also share things that are like safe sex pamphlets, also other materials necessary in COVID, such as alcohol, wipes, hygiene wipes, which are so necessary for homeless individuals, bottles of water, those types of items. And of course, they have faced certain issues, especially in terms of violence, because they do support LGBTQ plus community, and they also are very opposed and combat gender inequality. So, you know, as expected, there are individuals in our society who kind of see this as a threat, kind of see the solidarity movements as a threat. And sometime last year, their area was destroyed. So this is not just a silencing of voices, this is also a silencing of the structures that they have built. So they put the structures in place, and so someone came and violently kind of threw off the boxes and the shelves that they built. And of course, they rebuilt and kind of restructured themselves in order to continue their contribution to their town. And so when I kind of spoke to them, right, I was emailing back and forth, and they had a message which I'm going to share with you of kind of what is their model, what is their goal. And so, quote, "Natural disasters have afflicted Puerto Rico in the last few years, and we take the opportunity to denounce state negligence. We have firsthand experience with community members with the intention to redistribute non-perishable food, hygiene products, and other essentials to the community. Having said this, our work includes the feminist principle, which affirms that the personal is political, meaning we contribute to the expansion of holding the government accountable for their negligence and their task to fulfill the needs of oppressed citizens." So here we see the sentiment, right, end quote. Here we see the sentiment of distrust in the government, distrust in the government's ability to effectively distribute items, and how people in the community need to be in conversation together in order to properly distribute and kind of process these aspects of social aid.
Thank you to both Aleska and Natalia for sharing not only the work that we're doing together with Comek Lihial, but also for sharing about each of your microsites. And thank you all for listening to us talk about our project. We very much appreciate this opportunity.
Yes, thank you, Ricia, Natalia, and Aleska for sharing with us those incredible accounts and the projects that the students have been very creatively put together. I think that we have a few minutes for the students to pose some questions to the three of you. So let's use their time, please. Who wants to start?
I can go first. Thank you all for sharing. I have a lot of questions, but I guess because of time, I'll kind of make it a general one. Do you receive a lot of hesitancy from community members to participate in your projects, or are they super open to participating?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. Thank you very much for asking that. From my perspective, folks are absolutely thrilled and energized to have an opportunity to speak. And I think that for me, that's about intergenerational, sorry, it's a little bit late for me, intergenerational colonialism, and this idea that people are silenced year after year and people are not encouraged or allowed to participate in public discourse. Natalia or Aleska, do you want to talk at all about, Aleska, you just we wrote together an email and you sent it out cold with no previous contact. Do you want to talk about the response that you had?
Yeah, it was absolutely unexpected, the quickness with which they respond, because also we're in kind of a crisis right now that they're responding to, right? So there's this law kind of happening, trying to destroy public education, the pensions of workers and that kind of stuff. So they are directly involved in the university and trying to help students that are in the university protesting. So I really wasn't expecting that quick of a response from them, because they are out there kind of doing their job. And it was very active, and they really have a hold on how they explain their project and the necessity of their project. And so I think that they were just eager to kind of begin a conversation, kind of start a conversation with others, so that people can also start this mutual aid kind of systems all over the island, hopefully.
So in my experience, it was a little bit more casual because I actually know the members of the organization, but everyone has always been really willing and open to speak with us and share their experience. And if I ask, do you know someone that might have had an experience like this, there's always someone that has been willing to talk to me. And to add to what Dr. Chansky was saying, I also feel that there has been a sort of neglect from the government that has happened since Hurricane Maria, that it really just left the people wanting to be heard. And so just us giving them the opportunity to have a platform where their voices can be listened, I think that it really helps them and sort of motivates them to participate.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I think Natalia is a really beautiful example of why this project works so well, because every student is asked to think about what connection they want to pursue. And I would say 95% of the students involved in the project say, I want to go to my home community. And so it's not necessarily a person who doesn't know anything about the community, doesn't know anyone in that community walking in saying, hello, who would like to talk to me? But it's somebody who's like, oh, you're my mom's friend. Oh, you are the person that I talk to about X every time and so I think that that's why the project works so well. If we did it a different way, I'm not sure that it would work quite as well, but there's some inherent trust in the fact, and even Aleska's project, she's a student in Mayaguez talking to an organization, Mayaguez, that often collaborates with students in Mayaguez. And so some of the things about, what are the issues in our home communities that we want to talk about make the project work, I think. Thanks for that question.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much for the presentation, Ricia, Natalia, and Aleshka. I'm just curious about how did you manage or how did you deal with this relationship between the emotional thing and how this emotional issue could like intervene in the way action is taken and how the community like did also talk about that. Thank you.
Yeah, Alejandro, that's such a good question. And I don't know that we can successfully answer it in one conversation. You are very welcome to come over for coffee and talk with us for a couple of hours. I'm going to give an answer, but I think that Aleshka and Natalia probably have better answers to this. I think that we're very much together and we're very much focused on trying to take care of each other and trying to support each other. And I will freely admit that I'm a crier and that this work makes me cry. And I think that's okay. I think the day that it doesn't make me cry, there's a problem. And I will also say that, you know, I am very good friends with some of my narrators at this point, and I understand that in a mass listening project, when you're talking about hundreds of stories, you can't necessarily be close friends with everyone. But, you know, I have narrators who call me to tell me when good things and bad things happen in their life. And, you know, I go to people's houses for cake, you know, and so I think that the era, and this is just me speaking here, I think that the era in which we're supposed to be detached scientists of the sort of neoliberal humanistic stage, that era is over, or that's over for me. And the story that I always go back to is, you know, you cannot stand in a water line with your students for 6 hours and then go back to class the next day and be like, hello, I totally ignore the fact that neither one of us had clean drinking water. And we stood side by side as humans trying to get a bucket of clean water. And so I think that recognizing that we're all human and recognizing that that means that we all have complex emotions and that we're co-participants in a communal trauma is really important. And I actually got into a little disagreement with a scholar who was saying to me, you know, if you're emotional about the work you're doing, you shouldn't be doing that work. And I 100% disagree with that. And I do believe that when we're personally invested in our work, we do a better job. And when we're talking about solidarity and mutual aid and community-oriented work, it's important to have those human connections. Aleshka and Natalia, do you want to respond?
Well, at least for me, like Dr. Chansky said, the best part of it has been able to have the support of my teammates with me. For example, in our interview with Lucy, she made a comment that really affected me personally and made me cry during the interview. But I was so lucky that I had Aleshka there with me, and she completely picked up and she kept going with the interview as if nothing had happened, giving me the opportunity to sort of compose myself and come back to that. So I would just say the support of the team it's what allows me to do a good job in this.
Thank you for that, Natalia. I have to say also the support you've given me. I love it. And interviewing Lucy was also a very emotional part for me because I am someone that has been helped by her organization. I'm about to cry right now. So this dress I have on actually was given to me in Come Colegial. They have given me money for shopping and a bunch of stuff. It's just, the work she does is amazing. And I'm just so happy that we get to interview her, that we get to memorialize her work. I'm sorry.
Aleshka, we love and support you, and we are very proud of you. And we are absolutely delighted that this project can help all of us give back to Lucy, who is an amazing, amazing human. So Alejandro, we are so invested in this project personally, as you can see from the three of us starting to cry here. And Lucy and Come Colegial is not a separate thing from our lives. It is a part of our lives. I have fed students since 2014 through that. It says on my syllabus that I have an everybody eats policy in every single one of my courses, where I will feed anybody who needs it, and I leave food outside of my office door. And so I think that that's we're not getting through this alone. And I hope that no student involved in this project thinks that they have to get through this alone. I think that Natalia and Aleska and I will be friends for the rest of our lives. I think that we've built something different here. And I'm not saying burn it all down, but I'm kind of saying burn it all down. That, we need to think about how we do research and projects in different ways. And I don't think it's good to say that the faculty members on one side of the desk and the students on the other side of the desk. And I don't think it's good to say that scholars are inside the university and community partners are something separate. I think we're all partners, and supporting each other for a common good is kind of how we get through that. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Muchas gracias again.
Thank you so much, Aleska.
Yeah, thank you so much to Ricia, Natalia, and Aleska. It has been so powerful to listen to you, and also to think of food traditions as a form of mutual aid in response to disaster, right? We're going into overtime here, so just to honor everybody's time. There are two students who did not get a chance to ask questions, Emma and Leslie, but they're supposed to be writing a letter to Natalia and also to Aleska as part of the Climates of Inequality. So I'm going to have them, hold on their questions and post those in the letter that the class is going to get to all of you. And I have been reminded, Ricia, if you can pick a number 1 through 26 for the raffle.
23.
Okay.
That's my mom's birthday. Hi, Mom.
Thank you for picking 23. It looks like the person who won the book raffle is Nancy Morales. So yay for Nancy. We'll reach out to you after the program.
Congratulations, Nancy. I hope you really enjoyed reading the book. It's fantastic. Just want to give my thank you to the student panelists, the LCC staff, the Humanities Action Lab. They were hosting the webinar, and all of you for listening, for sharing a space with us today. Curiosity for the life of our friends in Puerto Rico, and also for sharing purpose to build and sustain collective power, right? And action to tackle the climate emergencies that is harming communities locally, nationwide, and worldwide. I hope you can enjoy us in our final Climates of Inequality presentation, which is scheduled for Wednesday, November 10th at 4:30. And this will be with guest speaker Maria Lopez Nunez from Ironbound Community Corporation in New York, and they're also partners in Climates of Inequality. And you can register in the LCC website for that particular presentation. So again, thank you to everyone, and have a wonderful evening, and stay warm because it's getting quite cold in Chicago now, unlike in Puerto Rico, right?
And thank you very much from our team. We really appreciate your engagement. And I know that I talked a little too much. And so if you do have a question that didn't get asked, please feel free to email us. We very much are very happy to talk to anybody who would like to.